The boy was warned not to whistle after dark. The elder said the dunes listened. That night, the campfire snapped. A gust rose without dust, and camel bells trembled though nothing moved. Footprints appeared just beyond the fire's edge, splayed and deep, circling where no one walked. Someone whispered, "Those made of smokeless fire." A hand reached for iron at a saddle. Another murmured a verse. Do you bargain, or do you bless? What began as a desert superstition becomes a ledger of choices. We'll trace how this fear took form from pre-Islamic sands. Description till one simple ritual detail finally matters. To understand why a whisper could command a caravan, we have to go back to Arabia before the word Djinn carried theology. The land itself set the rules. In open desert, light and heat seduced the eye, and wind sculpted sounds into voices. People mapped meaning onto wells, acacia groves, and cairns, because survival depended on predictability. Offerings of milk or grain were left where water rose. A broken taboo explained a broken ankle, a vanished goat, a fever that arrived without a wound. Spirits lived where human control ended. Poets gave those spirits sharper edges. In early Arabic poetry, some Qasida poets claimed a Karina companion from the unseen whose voice sharpened their lines at night. The claim didn't flatter ego. It accounted for the uncanny. If language arrives whole in the dark, who brought it? The Qarin stood between inspiration and danger, a reminder that brilliance might be borrowed, and a debt remains. Tribal shrines were not cathedrals. They were places saturated with fear and memory. An acacia that survived a lightning strike drew a ring of stones. A lonely boulder at a pass took on a name, and with it, etiquette. Don't pass without greeting. Don't camp without asking leave. Travelers poured a little water first for whoever was already there. The rule was simple. Acknowledge the prior claim of the unseen. Night divided the map again. People called the open dunes awash wild. Unspeaking and avoided them after dusk, unless necessity pressed. Campfires defined temporary borders. Beyond the glow, anything might lay claim. Practicalities grew into protocols. Keep sandals inside the tent. Mark latrine ground. Don't toss hot water into darkness. These weren't quirks. They were negotiations with powers that disliked surprise. Early categories took shape in stories that stayed because they explained risk. The ghoul skulked near ruins places where grief lingered, and jackals learned boldness. Hasila, shifting its face, belonged to the uncanny crowd at the edges of settlements, where a familiar voice called your name from the wrong direction. The Ifrit sensed his heat and force, belonged to places of exhaustion. Midday flats, abandoned wells, flashes of strength that overturned a tent peg like a child's toy. These weren't species carved in stone. They were recurring threats given names to help people remember. Trade routes braided these beliefs. Caravans stitched the Hijaz, the Yamama, and Yaman to the Levant and Mesopotamia. With frankincense and cloth came rumors, charms, and prayers. In Aramaic, people spoke of Janaya, protective or perilous spirits tied to locales. To the east, Mesopotamian Talis described wind-borne beings that slipped through cracks and rode dust devils. South Arabian inscriptions mentioned temple regulations and curses that assume other eyes watch human vows. The desert doesn't stop words. It teens them, then carries them farther. Meanwhile, anxiety traveled with the goods. Caravan leaders built rituals into the march. At noon, halt in Shay. At dusk, circle the animals tight. A scout walks the perimeter softly, eyes lowered as if not to provoke a gaze. If a voice calls from behind, answer later inside the circle, not in the open. The habit looks like superstition. It functions like insurance. Stakes were always tangible. A child's fever might be chalked to a spirit that disliked loud laughter at a threshold. A herder who cut across a grave-like mound and lost 3 goats to a sinkhole learned a proverb and a path to avoid. Illness sent people to those who knew herbs and words in equal measure, because causes in the desert often came without faces. It is important to note, this didn't mean randomness. It meant a pattern of respect, encoded as story. Parallels with neighboring cosmologies didn't erase local flavor. When someone in a caravan spoke of a wind thing that fingered tent flaps, another answered with a term from home, not a borrowed name. Yet the logic aligned. Spirits favored boundaries, doorways, wells, crossroads, the threshold between night and day. Protective practices converged as well. A knot tied at wrist or ankle, a scrap of metal at the tent's entrance, a whispered name that wasn't the traveler's. The poet's Karen carried consequences too. Praise could harden into satire, and satire could break a man's standing. If a verse landed like a curse, the poet might blame the companion who demanded sharper edges. Here's where the category bent toward ethics. Power borrowed from the unseen risked moral debt. People measured success against the cost of the bargain. As caravan towns grew, Petras echo in memory, Mecca and Yathrib. Consolidating trade ideas moved faster than sandstorms. Markets turned rumor into currency. A charm that worked in the south appeared in the north with a new recitation attached. A tale about a gull near an abandoned fort in one valley became a cautionary ghost at another ruin 200 miles away. What nobody knew at the time was how soon a new vocabulary would press these scattered fears into an ordered world, keeping the old edges while drawing new lines. Everything tilted when revelation gave language to the unseen. The Quran spoke of beings made from smokeless fire, who listened, reasoned, believed, disbelieved, and formed communities of their own. Suddenly, the wilderness voices weren't only capricious forces at boundaries. They were creatures under God, morally accountable. The map that once divided safe and unsafe space began to divide obedience and disobedience, not merely human and other. To understand this shift, we must look to the late antique world that surrounded the hidden. Judaism, Christianity, and local monotheisms had already framed the unseen in terms of allegiance to the one God. In that world, naming a class of beings that Djinn knew could hear recitation and respond brought the desert. It sold fears into a larger moral order. If a poet's companion whispered at night, that whisper now sat somewhere on a spectrum. Believer, skeptic, deceiver. Surah al-Djinn captured the moment when listeners from the unseen heard the Quran and recognized guidance. It is important to note what this reframing did to practice. Protection was no longer only a negotiation with local powers. It was alignment with a universal claim. Recitation became architecture. Verses were not simply spoken. They built a perimeter. Where a traveler once offered a handful of water at a lonely cairn, he now sought protection by invoking the name of God, a habit that would spread into greetings, thresholds, and tents. Monotheism also policed language. The older habit of asking the lords of a valley for shelter was discouraged and then condemned. Hospitality belonged to human hosts, protection to God. The unseen still inhabited valleys and wells, but their authority was subordinated. A woman who had blamed a fever on a resentful spirit might now seek remedy through prayer and lawful cure, while acknowledging that harm still moved through agents she couldn't see. Meanwhile, what nobody knew at the time was how many older shapes would survive beneath the new names. The Gulda, ruin haunter, didn't vanish. Its tactics remained familiar in storytelling. Misdirection, mimicry, luring the lone The Ifrit kept its association with heat and force in Tales, where strength served kings and tricked merchants. Islam supplied a taxonomy and a court. Folklore kept the local faces. The result was not erasure but absorption, a structured pantheon replaced by a single creator and a layered unseen. Law and ethics followed. If Djinn had agency, they could harm and be held responsible, yet their bodies and lives were not human. Jurists debated accidental injury, pouring hot water without naming God and scolding an unseen neighbor, then advised, courtesy is law. Announce, ask leave, restrain anger. Possession, once narrated as total abduction by a capricious being, became a contested territory where recitation, consent, and community intervention mattered. People described speech that wasn't a person's own, strength that didn't fit the frame, and pain that fled a verse, then returned when the verse stopped. The response turned toward ruqya, scriptural supplication within the bounds of faith, replacing charms that invoked unknown names. Everyday life shifted in small, repeatable acts. Amulets that once carried knots of uncertain origin now bore verses. Mothers still tied threads, but they tied words to them. Men still avoided whistling at night, not because the dunes wanted silence, but because needless provocation had no blessing in it. The structure of protection changed its rationale, not its rhythms. The threshold remained a boundary. The name of God made it legible. At the edges of empire, where Islam met older habit, syncretism pressed through. Storytellers kept the Silase's flash of shape-shifting and the gull's ruined stage, then placed them in a world where some Djinn prayed and others refused. A bargain in a marketplace tale might end with a contract sealed by oaths that had legal weight. A trickster encounter at a well could be resolved by calling the Adhan, not by leaving milk. It is important to note that scholarship sees continuity and function even when the language transformed. This was the moment everything changed in the caravan's logic of fear. Risk didn't vanish. It found procedure. A scout returning at dusk might quietly recite, greet the camp, and enter with right foot first. The same act that once acknowledged a prior local claim now asserted a higher jurisdiction. The desert answered back, as it always had, but the reply met a different authority. Through revelation, uncertainty was not eliminated. It was disciplined, absorbed into a cosmology where the unseen shared our roads, obeyed their Lord, and, like us, could be better or worse. While Islam reframed the unseen, older winds still moved across the map. To understand the forms the Djinn assumed in stories, we have to look outward Mesopotamia and the Levant, where desert, ruin, and boundary had long been populated with other names. The geographies overlap. The anxieties rhyme. What traveled wasn't a single creature, but a protective logic, a way of reading harm and safety across harsh terrain. Consider the Mesopotamian fear of what rode the wind. Texts and amulets from the Tigris-Euphrates plains describe beings that slipped through door cracks, clung to fevers, and preyed upon mothers and infants. Figures like Lamashtu and the Windamen Pazuzu became emblems of counterforce, one terrifying image pressed into service to repel another. The point wasn't devotion to a monster. It was a recognition that invisible assaults required visible, portable defenses. Desert caravans understood that idea instantly. If illness arrived like a draft, then any practice that sealed a threshold felt wise. Across the Levant, an adjacent Strandofen, called Lilith-adjacent in modern shorthand cast night, as a time when seduction and harm blurred. The specifics varied by community, yet the structure repeated: a solitary traveler, a voice in the dark, a promise that turned after the bargain. When Arabs told of a Sila changing face at the edge of a camp, they were not importing a single foreign tale. They were describing a shared region where night risked turning familiar outlines into traps. The names differed, the rules matched. Protective technologies aligned as well. Iron mattered in many places because it holds heat, resists time, and carries the reputation of the forge human mastery over fire. Knots mattered because they bound intention and slowed what should not spread. Names, said aloud, mattered because speech fixed attention and asserted authority. These are not arbitrary gestures. They are parallel solutions to the same vulnerability. The body at a doorway, the child in a cradle, the traveler at a crossroads. When later Muslims used Quranic recitation as a barrier, they were tapping the same protective logic already familiar along trade routes, now under a different theology. Ruin haunted both worlds, with the same persistence, in Iraq and Syria. Abandoned tells ancient mounds, layered with cities, were mapped by folklore as places where the past still breathed. Stories warned of scribes who weren't human in the collapsed halls, of lights that moved methodically across broken bricks. In Arabia, the Gal found its stage among ruined forts and deserted wells. The resonance is practical. Ruins shelter animals and thieves, and hustas often memories of plague and war. A tale that assigns those dangers to a ruin hunter keeps people cautious around unstable stone and old grief. A distinctive artifact speaks to shared technique. Aramaic incantation bowls, buried upside down beneath thresholds in late antiquity. Inscribed spirals of text meant to trap or divert harmful spirits. Their power, in the minds that used them, lay in language arranged with care at the very point of entry. Centuries later, Arabic ruqya, Emphasize the recitation at thresholds doors. Here's the edge of a room where a person turned text into a wall. The continuity is not about borrowing words. It is about trusting that spoken order reshapes unseen disorder. Greek and Syriac monastic writers, stationed in deserts and rocky valleys, wrote about demons that loved waste. Their caution reads like a caravan manual. Avoid solitude without prayer. Do not answer voices that address you by name from beyond the path. Fast, but do not taunt what you don't understand. Moving from this region to the Arabian heartlands, we find similar advice in Bedouin practice, later reframed within Islamic piety. The overlap suggests that people living where silence amplifies the mind's edge encounter the same categories of fear and discipline. However, the record shows a limit to what we can claim. It is tempting to draw straight lines, to say that a named Mesopotamian demon became a particular Djinn. Scholarship urges caution. We see resonance-shared motifs, convergence solutions more often than lineage. Trade, intermarriage, and migration moved customs in both directions. But the desert is a great editor. It strips stories to function. What survives are techniques at work. Bless before you pour. Mark your threshold. Bind what you cannot hold with your hands. Those echoes settled into types that storytellers could summon by name without footnotes. A gal at ruins signals caution, not taxonomy. An ifrit, in a palace anecdote, signals dangerous leverage. Power that can be bargained with at a cost. A shapeshifter at the edge of a camp signals the danger of answering a voice you want to hear. The borrowed faces aren't evidence of a single origin. They are proof that human beings, across contiguous landscapes, keep building the same tools against the same winds. By now, the shapes have settled into names that carry territories. Sea, temptation, companionship each. A way to navigate risk with a story in hand. The catalog isn't a zoology, it is a guide to thresholds. The Ifrit moves first, because strength and heat announce themselves. In folktales, Ifrits stride where exhaustion presses humans thin midday flats, parched wadis. The vaults of kings who believe power can be commanded. Their bodies, said to be of smokeless fire, signify force that outlasts the human pulse. In courts and bazaars, an Ifrit appears when leverage isn't moral but transactional. Service bargained, never owned. A ruler might demand a treasure lifted, or a rival frightened. Just as a desert traveler fears a sudden wait, a crushing presence at noon. The lesson is constant. Ifrits do not serve without cost. They honor bargains the way fire honors a wick by consuming it. Microstories worn in precise gestures. A merchant offers 3 nights of oil in exchange for 1 night of protection across a haunted pass. The Ifrit keeps the jackals away, then returns, not for oil, but for the merchant's silent hours, claiming the man's tongue must carry no slander for a month. The deal holds, business suffers. Reputation heals. The audience understands. Strength purchased bends the buyer. Marad belonged to a different border, the sea, and its thresholds. Later, Litera suppresses them into glass and brass, but the older intuition is coastal. Pride clings to them. The tide teaches that nothing is ever fully yielded. Caravans that met ships at harbors learned a second kind of negotiation. Not with heat, but with depth. Merit bargains, Asker oaths, lineage names, and a price at the edge of salt. A fisherman promises a portion of the catch to unseen keepers of the cove. When he breaks his word, nets tear and storms arrive on clear horizons. In Palace Talis, a Maraid demands the right formula, the exact name, the proper sequence of praise before it will lift a stone or reveal a passage. The moral is not submission to a sea. It is attention to order in liminal zones, where pride and chaos move together. Shaitan is often misheard as a species, but it is, within Islamic language, a moral vector, a role any unseen creature, human or jinn, can inhabit when it tempts, lies, or breaks oaths. Shaitan marks a function, the whisper that distorts a lawful desire, the suggestion that a shortcut will not cost you. In stories, a friendly stranger at dusk who urges you to skip a blessing speaks with a shaitanic edge. Legal discourse treats the category with care because intention matters. A harm urged by a shaitan doesn't excuse the act. It clarifies the context inside the person. The landscape is the same. The line is ethical, not topographical. Kareen, by contrast, folds the unseen into intimacy. The Kareen is the companion who shadows a life, the voice that mirrors a mood, the rival self that suggests a sharper word, the muse that brings a line whole and demands a price in wakefulness. In verse, a poet credits a Kareen for sudden eloquence. In household lore, a person blames the Kareen when an old habit reasserts itself at the worst moment. Reports in the tradition speak of each person having such a companion, some subdued by discipline, others noisy across years. The Kareen turns cosmology inward. The boundary becomes a rib cage. Domestic spirits extend this intimacy to the places we claim. The amber associated with houses, wells, and latrines remind people that habitation breeds etiquette. Say Bismillah before entering. Avoid idle singing in a latrine. Knock softly at a closed door. Even Juron. Such habits discipline the abruptness that offends neighbors seen and unseen. When people pour hot water with a word of permission, they aren't dramatizing fear. They're maintaining a social world that includes what they believe shares their roof. Across these types, bargains and courtesies draw the map. A generous gift in the wrong place invites obligation. Miserliness in a charged place invites humiliation. A traveler who returns a lost trinket found at a ruin refuses. A reward sleeps. Well, another Hupakis that finds his camel refusing to rise. The cost of crossing boundaries appears in small misfortunes that, accumulated, look like instruction. Belief lives because practice confirms it. At night, a parent ties a verse near a cradle, combs a child's hair forward, not back, to avoid inviting attention. A sailor touches iron at the prow, not as idolatry, but as the memory of every voyage that returned. A poet steps outside the tent before reciting, honoring both muse and neighbors. These gestures, repeated, turn types into territories. And when fear stirs at the edge of the firelight, names help people choose. Negotiate with heat, respect the tide, resist the whisper, quiet the companion. Living with Djinn meant turning thresholds into habits. At a doorway, people greeted before entering, not only for courtesy to those inside, but to declare the space aligned. Travelers paused at the edge of wadis and graveyards, said a brief blessing, and stepped in with care. The greeting was practical theology. This place has order. I'm entering under it. Sound became structure. The Adan reset a quarter of a city's fear line by line, while Bismillah before work, food, or sleep marked attention at the smallest hinges of life. Recitation, learned as children, became a portable wall. A whispered verse before untying a knot, before lifting a lid, before walking into night was less performance than discipline. The mind refusing to wander where it shouldn't. Materials carried memory. Iron at a lintel did not rival faith. It recalled the forge and human craft that resist, where salt on thresholds and in cooking reminded households of preservation and purity. Incense rose in steady columns that transformed a nervous room into a measured one. Knots bound the anxious impulse to touch everything at once. They localized worry and asked it to wait. None of this worked as a charm without intention. The practice required a posture. Name God, then use what your elders handed you. Healing drew community around the afflicted. When someone spoke in a register that wasn't theirs, or fainted as if pushed by an empty hand, people gathered with recitation rather than accusation. Rukia, done by someone trusted, stitched scripture to breath, then to water, then to the room. The process restored sequence. God first, then remedy, then rest. Herbal knowledge remained. Close seats, smoke, compresses, but the names invoked narrowed to what the conscience allowed. Etiquette managed what law couldn't see. Don't whistle at night. It calls attention across boundaries you can't police. Don't pour hot water into drains or earth without a word. Announce to neighbors you can't meet. Don't boast, especially alone. Pride is a provocation, and, in stories, the shortest path to visitation. Even laughter had volume rules after dark. The point wasn't austerity. It was coexistence. Modernity didn't dissolve the field. Itridru, Italiano. Radios crackled in desert trucks and acquired stories' voices answering back on empty frequencies. Jokes that finished themselves. Songs heard without a signal. In apartments, people spoke of stairwells without echoes. Elevators that stopped at uncalled floors. And the old rules migrated. Greet the threshold. Avoid idle taunting. Keep verses near the places machines isolate you. Technology became a new wilderness. The logic stayed. Negotiation, finally, took the form of restraint. If an object that feels refused won't leave a ruin, let it be. If a dream repeats with a demand, answer with prayer, not bargains. If a child reports a companion who asks for secret oaths, widen the circle, bring elders. Bring recitation, bring daylight. The best tales end with dignity intact because someone declined the shortcut, paid respect, and walked away. Conclusion. What the Djinn tell us, 100 words. The Djinn record, where our boundaries fray home. Courage to pride, habit to faith. They mark the places we negotiate uncertainty with courtesy, speech, and restraint, reminding us that power without reverence costs more than it pays. If this illuminated how deserts, ports, and prayers shaped a living cosmology, we may follow its older layers in a future episode.